Okay, welcome everyone. What I'm going to do for today's presentation is just to give you a bit of a formal talk to begin with, because there are some conceptual ideas about my pedagogy for this particular course that I'd like to talk about, and it's a bit hard to talk about that informally, but then I'd like to be a little bit more informal after that. So this discussion has as its focus the pedagogic process of teaching dramatic literature in a way that encourages students to appreciate the creation of a stage production from the realisation of a dramatic script. As Senior Lecturer in Literature with SLAM, I'm responsible for coordinating and teaching LL206, which is Introduction to Dramatic Literature. Many of my students have never before seen a film version, for instance, of Sophocles' Oedipus or Shakespeare's Macbeth, Ibsen's A Doll's House, among other plays, let alone actually have read them. And what, in fact, we all have come to the conclusion, particularly in terms of our pedagogy, that English isn't a first language for many students. So as a lecturer, it was very important to me, teaching English literature, to do it in a way in which embraces the cultural diversity of my students. So when I looked initially at the course outline, because when I arrived in Suva, I arrived 1 week after the session had already begun. I considered the actual scripts that were and the literature that was being covered for this particular course, and the kinds of learning experiences that were scheduled. And for me, it didn't make any sense at all to try to engage students in dramatic literature without some dramatic component to it. So what I did, I'll just give you a little bit of a preamble to the particular course that I'm subjecting, I guess, to the microscope today. So this is a survey course intentionally. It provides basically an overview of the nature and variety of dramatic forms which have developed in several cultures over the last 2.5 millennia. So the course is offered as a single major in a double, and also as a double major if you want to, in the literature program, but can also be taken as a single course or a single unit. The course itself is offered both face-to-face and DFL, and the face-to-face cohort consists of around 55 students and the DFL around 25. So the way that I've changed the particular mode of teaching for this session relates specifically to the face-to-face component, because I found as well when I arrived that the DFL students had already received their mail packages, so there was no real chance to alter what had already been set in terms of the trajectory of the learning that those students were going to have. So again, the presentation looks specifically at the internal cohort. And I'll just give you a quick, brief synopsis of the kinds of literature that we're looking at in this particular course. So topic 1 starts just with an overview, and then we move into Greek tragedy, looking particularly at Oedipus. Then we do Shakespeare's Macbeth. Then we look at Moliere's Comédie Tartuffe. Also we look at realism, Ibsen's A Doll's House. Later on, a bit of Brecht. And then Theatre of the Absurd, Waiting for the Godot. And then after that we look specifically at Fijian dramatic literature. So there are 4 weeks dedicated specifically to that form. Okay, so I'll move on now. In terms of the organisation of this particular mode, there are 2 one-hour lectures for students, and also a 1-hour tutorial. But again, this changes subject to what's actually happening in the course. So I've just given times and locations. Again, the lectures are set and students have the choice of attending one one-hour tutorial. Okay, so this is the schedule, and again it makes specific references to the kinds of course material that is being looked at and what weeks we look at that particular material. And what I'm going to do today is basically talk about what happens from here, from the third week, where there is significant change in terms of how I was delivering this particular course. In terms of the assessment, there is only there are two assessment items. An essay, which again I believed was necessarily essential in terms of writing about dramatic literature, but the major component is the end of session dramatic performance, which is worth 60% of their grade. And that particular assessment item is impossible to fail if you commit yourself wholeheartedly to your group. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Just a little bit more, the end of session performances, students organised themselves into groups, and this was in our second week and our third week. The students were old enough, I believed, to do this themselves, so I took no part in their organisation. And so we have a very dynamic mix, actually, of Fijians and Indo-Fijians, as well as some Canadian students and American students. Now, because the students involved in the end of session performances will essentially be presenting to an audience a form of theatre called flash drama. And flash drama is a new style of performance essentially based on one act and has a small group of characters, usually around 3 or 4. So what students are doing for their major dramatic performance is a version, a hybrid version, if you like, of flash drama, where they're actually basing their flash on an existing text. All right? So what they will be doing is presenting a scene from a particular text, and because their audiences will only be seeing that scene, what groups will need to do is also have an introduction where there's a person that speaks almost like a Greek chorus and presents what's happened in the play preceding what they flash, the scene that they flash. And they also need to present after their performance a conclusion, so that even though audiences might not see the whole performance, all acts, they can get a basic understanding of the whole play in a flash. Okay, so in groups themselves, students needed to think about the following things. Who will take roles? What kind of characters? They needed to think about their scene. They needed to think also about the staging of that particular scene in terms of costumes, sets, lights, materials. Also, what was going to be happening during that performance is that somebody's going to film the performance, and those films will be uploaded onto YouTube so that students will have their naming rights, if you like. Okay, now each group also met outside of their tutorial times, and group leaders were responsible for taking notes and minutes of what was occurring in those group times. So essentially what they were producing were documents that detailed who was attending and who was contributing to the group. And those documents will be essential in terms of the assessment as well, because it makes students accountable. Okay. So again, I've talked a little bit about the introduction that students will need to give preceding their flash. And again, this incorporates a synopsis of the play and also what's happened before in the play itself before they present their flash. They also need to produce, as I said, a conclusion. And again, there will be one member of the group who presents the final conclusion and resolution for their audience in terms of what's happened with that play. So much like the essay, an introduction has particular components, conclusion has particular components as well. So these texts need to produce and reproduce the form of the essay, if you like, in that it needs to encompass a story and it needs to tell a story, but also offer a conclusion. Now, what I'll be showing you today is an idea of what actually happens when we have our tutorial times. When we have our lecture times, they're quite formal, so I'll present lecture materials on a specific reading for that week. So there is that formal aspect, and when we have our tutorial times, that becomes the more interactive time for students to be involved in the dramatic text as a text itself. So the teaching schedule from the week beginning the 1st of August, because again I've arrived the week preceding that week. Students again organised themselves into groups, and that in that time they needed to define what those groups were going to do and also define their performance play. Now, from the next few weeks, what would happen during our tutorial times was either one of two things. Either for the first schedule, we would have an introduction and there would be 10 minutes basically of warm-up drama games. And there's a variety of games that I've listed here. I was actually going to encourage you to try some of these games myself, but I won't do that today. So there's a variety of games that we play for the first 10 minutes. And for the next 10 to 40 minutes, we do shared reading. And this is when we look specifically at one of the plays on the schedule. And then we do some summary after that. And here's an example of one of the drama games, Mirrors, it's called. So two people stand facing one another. And this was very difficult for students actually to do. I think because there's a cultural issue in terms of actually looking directly at somebody for a long period of time and standing quite closely to them and then mirroring that image of the other person. But students, to their credit, were very happy to engage in that, and they did have a lot of fun. We also practiced status pictures, which again in pairs. This is about status, so one character needs to be higher, the other one lower, and there's a need then to look at the body and use the body in terms of presenting that status as much as the reflection of the idea of power. So here's basically a picture of what I mean. Okay, there's also a few others, but I really want to show you some of the film productions that we've done so far. So in terms of...
just remind you of the time.
Yes, yes.
We've got the 1 minute.
Oh my goodness, 1 minute, right. Okay, I'm really going to flick fast now, just to show you a couple of movies. Okay, and I'll just show you some samples. This was a snapshot of Oedipus from Open Day, and it happened very early in the semester. So I'm going to show you a little bit about this and then show you the more recent, so you can see a real difference in terms of students. So the girl in the crown is Oedipus, and the performer who's wearing the cape is a priest. Sorry about this. Okay, sorry about the film quality. I took it on my mobile, actually. So that gives you a bit of an idea. Very early in the semester, they're actually reading. They haven't memorised anything. So what I'm going to do now, again, I have all of this image that I wanted to show you, but I've run out of time. I'll show you this one that I took this week, actually. So these students are performing a part section of Molière's comedy Tartuffe.
And action.
That's Tartuffe. Okay, so quite a marked difference from the first style of presentation from students to what we're starting to see now, a real engagement with the dramatic text, but also with each other in the performance of that text. But I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.